Please help me welcome founder and CEO of Red 6, Daniel Robinson.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you. It's just great to be in Orlando and meet all of you guys. Thank you all for coming and listening to my story. I have to thank Amy, for sure, and Sheena has to be around there. Sheena at the back. So Sheena, special thanks to Sheena. I spoke at the Global AR/VR Summit in Vancouver about 2 years, and I walked off stage, and within half a second, Sheena was right here. And she goes, hey, you got to come to Orlando and check out what we're doing in Orlando. And I guess she hasn't stopped since, because we're back in Orlando 2 years later. So Sheena, thank you. I really do appreciate the work. The best. The best. I asked Sheena what she actually wanted me to talk about, and she said, just tell a story. Tell your story that you told in Canada. So I'm going to tell you my story. And we're going to talk about tech, and I'll show you Red 6. But really, it's a human story that hopefully it will resonate, and hopefully you'll identify with both the ups and downs of life and the challenges involved in getting to ultimately where we are today. Steve Jobs, in his, I think it was a Stanford commencement speech, he talked about connecting the dots in life. And I'm about to completely destroy this. But in essence, the sentiment, or I'm paraphrasing what he was saying, was you have to have a passion, because it's very difficult to connect the dots looking forward in your life and understand where you're going. So you have to have a passion, and you have to follow that passion with every ounce of your being. And at some point, you will arrive at an intersection in your life where those dots connect. And you will have the right experience, the right network, the right education, and the right vision. Those dots will connect, and you'll find yourself off and running with something that is pretty special. And that's happened to me on a couple of occasions in life. So I'm going to tell you my story. And I'm going to tell you my story and how the dots connected for me. I have about 4 slides and 3 videos to show you. So unfortunately, you're going to be listening to me talking a little bit. Where do I come from? I come from basically a field in the northeast of England. I grew up in a coal mining town in the northeast of England, synonymous with shipbuilding and coal mining. I grew up in the 1980s under Thatcherism. And under Thatcherism, that town saw systematic economic decline. We saw the eradication of the shipbuilding industry. We saw the eradication of the coal mines for various reasons. But what we saw over time was social deprivation and an economy and a town and an area struggling to get back on its feet. There was not much to do in my town, but we did have one movie theater. And my dad, when I was a little boy, would once a month take me to a movie theater. And the first movie I saw was Superman with the late, great Christopher Reeve. And when I saw Superman flying through Manhattan along Fifth Avenue, I was hooked. I was inspired. So much so that I kid you not, I came out of that movie theater and I would spend hours in the garden, standing like this, desperately thinking, if I concentrate hard enough, I'm going to get airborne and fly. And that was the genesis of my love affair with aviation. The second movie I remember seeing was Star Wars. And whilst I thought lightsabers were cool, I was obsessed with X-Wing fighters. So I would dream of Luke Skywalker, in his X-Wing, ripping down through the Death Star. And I'd go out into my back garden, and I'd literally play in the mud, and I'd build an X-Wing fighter cockpit out of stones for switches and sticks for control columns. I was going to be an X-Wing fighter pilot when I was big. And when I was about 12 or 13 years old, much like a couple of people in this audience, I'm sure, I was on an island with my sister on a family vacation, and every afternoon, the gentleman in the beach hut where they'd sell drinks would show illegal pirated copies of videos. And in those days over in Europe, whatever you saw in the US, we would get about a year or 18 months later if we were lucky. And one day we were sitting there watching this video, and on the screen came up this movie, Top Gun. And when I looked at that, I thought, my God, that's actually a job. That's the job I want to do. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a fighter pilot. So I went back to my town. I went ripping into school, and we would do a class in school called Personal Social Education. And it's basically, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so aspirations for kids in the town in those days were fairly low. And we'd want to be a coal miner. We wanted to be maybe an electrician, or noble jobs, but the horizons of the kids were limited. And we had to write it on a piece of paper, and I dared to write, I want to be a fighter pilot. And I took it up to my teacher, and he would read them out. And he was going through all of them, and he got to mine, and he said, Mr. Robinson, come and stand up here. So I thought, fantastic. I'm going to top of the class. So he brings me up, and he looks at me, and he smiles. And he said, Mr. Robinson here thinks he's better than everyone else. Mr. Robinson wants to be a fighter pilot. And all the kids started laughing. And he looked at me, and he said, go sit down and write something sensible. So I went, huh. The absolute opposite of what you guys do here, right? So I sat down and I was humiliated, and I had to write again. He said, come on, hurry up. So I scribbled a few things down, and I took it up to him in a hurry, and he looked down at it again. He smiled, and he said, get out of the classroom. Go give me 10 laps of the playground in the pouring down rain. Because that second piece of paper said, I want to be a fighter pilot. And so I went outside. The kids were all laughing at me, and I ran down around the playground in circles. And it was the greatest thing he could have done for me, because that ignited a spark in me, which became a fire, which became a passion. And I was like, I'll show you. You tell me something's not possible, I'll show you. Conversely, at the time, my first job, I was a milkman. So I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I would deliver milk around the streets of the northeast of England, and I earned a grand old 40 pounds a week. And with that money, I saved up to get my first flying lesson. And I went along to a local flying school, and I met a gentleman who became a mentor of mine called Peter Gray. And Peter Gray took me flying. And Peter, after one flight with me, the antithesis of this teacher, he came back and he put his arm around me and he patted me on the shoulder. He said, look, I think you may have a little bit of talent. He was wrong. But he said, I think you might have a little bit of talent. You should consider a career in aviation. Let me tell you about the Royal Air Force and the scholarship scheme with the Royal Air Force. And so he told me about the Royal Air Force scholarship scheme, which gave me a focus and a determination to sit down in school and focus that I am going to do everything I possibly can to get myself to the Air Force Academy, Cranwell in the UK. And after a number of years, I did that. So I find myself at the Air Force Academy, and I go through officer training, and I'm terrible, and I'm too young, and I kind of know what I'm doing, but I kind of don't. And at one point, I get kicked back a course because I'm not quite keeping up with everyone else, and I kind of suck, frankly. But I managed, by the skin of my teeth, to claw my way through that course. And I pop out at the end of that, and I go into flight training. But I'm still fundamentally this underconfident kid from the northeast of England, and I didn't think I was good enough for any of this. But I entered into flight training, and I was surrounded by Cambridge graduates and Oxford graduates, and there was little old me. And over time, I realized that as I was going through training, these people would start to disappear. And as I got towards the end of 4, maybe 5 years of training in the UK, it was a long time because I was dealing with bad weather, I look around, and there's not many of us left. And all of a sudden, I'm a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force. And this was around August of 2001. We all know what happened in September of 2001. So the backdrop of my first tour in flying Tornadoes for the Royal Air Force was against the backdrop of operations in the Middle East. So the guys would be backwards and forwards. After about 3 years flying that jet, which was just a huge privilege, I'm living this childhood dream, my squadron commander comes to me and he said, hey, would you be interested in going to the Qualified Weapons Instructor course? You guys may know it as Fighter Weapons School. Colloquially, you'll know it as Top Gun, and we actually have a real Top Gun. Where are you at, T-Mac? We have a real Top Gun graduate in the audience right now. And I said, excuse me, what? He said, yeah, I'd like to recommend you for this school. Now, to be clear, at the time, I'd only had 3, maybe a little more years of experience on the jet. I went very, very early, and I didn't think I was ready for this at all, and frankly, I wasn't. But he said to me, look, this is a challenge in your career and a gamble you're going to take in your career. If you pull this off at such an early age, it will set you up for great things. And if you don't, we'll deal with that, and we'll come through. Would you like to take the risk? I said, yeah, I'll take the risk. So off I went to the weapons instructor course. And it was astonishingly difficult. So I got there, and I wasn't good enough to get through that course. I was okay with the airplane, but I wasn't tactically aware enough. I wasn't experienced enough, frankly. And the guys did a really good job of putting their arms around me and helping me to get through that course, to the point where I popped out at the end, and I was like, okay, I kind of made it through. It was a scrape, but I'm through. I'm qualified. And that sent me back to the frontline squadrons, where I started a career in teaching. And there's a couple of the guys here that have the same qualifications. And as a weapons school graduate, you basically become the teacher of the teachers. So you go back and you start to really exert an influence on a squadron. Once I was back on the squadron, and having gone through the weapons instructor course, you can expect some pretty decent opportunities. And one of the opportunities that was presented to me was an exchange tour to the United States. And I, for my entire life, wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot. I wanted to fly off the carriers. And my colleague T-Mac, again, F-18 pilot in the back seat here, in the back of the room here, is a real one. But I wanted to go fly off carriers. So I'd applied for the United States Navy F-18 exchange. And at the time, I looked around at the short list of people that were available for that exchange, and I thought, I think this could be me. Maybe I'm going to get this exchange. And in the UK, what we'd do is at the end of flying, generally we'd go to the bar and we'd debrief in the bar and we'd have a couple of drinks and we'd go through the lessons learned of the day. And the squadron commander at the time had invited us all into the bar. So we came into the bar and he said, look, guys, I've got a big announcement. He said, you all know that Dan's applied for the F-18 exchange, right? Well, I'm here to tell you on this occasion he's been unsuccessful. I thought, why would you do that? Public humiliation. He said, look, he's worked really hard. He's obviously, been through some hoops, but on this occasion, he's not been selected for the F-18. And I was standing there with my pint of Guinness, devastated at the public humiliation and just, I'm not going to the Navy to fly F-18s off the carrier. And he let me sit with that for a few seconds. And everyone started commiserating me. And he said, actually, hang on, guys, there's a reason he hasn't been selected for the F-18 exchange. And the reason he hasn't been selected for the F-18 exchange is he's just been selected as the first non-American in the world to fly the F-22 Raptor, which is this airplane. Now, I'm standing there. You've got to imagine I'm standing there with my beer. I drop my beer. The next thing I remember is the squadron jumping on top of me and beating me to the ground. And I remember coming to on my back, looking up, and my squadron commander was standing over me. And I looked at him and I said, is this true? And he said, yeah. And he pulled me up and he shook my hand. He said, very well deserved, young man. And he said, Dan, this exchange is going to change your life in ways that you will carry with you forever, that you don't even understand yet. And boy, was he true. Boy, was he correct. So he said, you leave in 4 weeks. You're going to go fly stealth fighters for the United States Air Force. So boom, here I come. And I actually arrive in Virginia, Langley, Virginia. Now, the gentleman sitting there in the black polo shirt with the red 6 on his shirt, I arrived, and this jet at the time, the most capable combat airplane in the world by far. It was, an immensely classified program. It is now, but even back then, it was something else. And Monster, who I'm lucky enough to work with again, was actually the first weapons officer on the first F-22 squadron ever. And I arrive on the squadron, I'm like, hey, I'm Dan from England, and half the people knew I was coming, half of them didn't. It was kind of really messy. There was a mixture of excitement, resentment, it was chaos. And this gentleman put his hand out, shook me by the hand and said, hey, here's a bunch of books, can you help me do this? And I was straight into the squadron. And so began 3 astonishing years of life on the F-22. And publicly, Monster, I have to say thank you for that. It was an incredible welcome. And so now I'm working with some of the most capable human beings I've ever met in my life, and I'm flying the most capable airplane in the world. And this airplane is an entire lecture in itself. But suffice to say that nothing comes close. To this day, nothing comes close. It is an astonishing platform. And so I got real insight into some of the capabilities associated with this platform. But at the same time, I got insight into some of the real limitations with it. And some of the problems facing not just this platform, but the broader combat air force. What am I talking about? I'm really talking about training. How do we train? Because very simply, every time we go up in our F-22 to fly and train, we need someone to go fly and train against. And that is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year problem that we were not solving back then. We were not solving it for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's very expensive. Secondly, we don't have enough assets to do it. Thirdly, we don't have enough fighter pilots to do it. There was a chronic shortage, which has only gotten far worse since then. And I think most importantly of all, and the thing that I didn't realize at the time, but became the genesis of Red 6, was in 2006, 2009 timeframe, we'd spent 20, 25 years fighting combat operations in the Middle East, supporting the guys and girls on the ground. Really important work. But my view was we'd taken our eye off what was actually happening geopolitically on the world stage, and which is acutely defined right now. And that was the reemergence of Russia onto the world stage as a state actor, and critically the pace of innovation in China. Why is that significant? It's significant because even if we had the pilots, the airplanes, the budgets, it was very difficult for us to simulate the kind of threats that we may be called to go against. Platforms like J-20, Su-57, we couldn't do it. Even with F-22s, it was very difficult to do that. So I started looking at this as a real problem. Now, life would take me in a number of different paths after the Air Force. I decided to leave the Air Force in 2009 following my F-22 exchange. It was for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is I'd fallen in love with the United States. I'd fallen in love with what I felt it was to be an American. and working with patriots, two of which are in the room, they really taught me what it was to be an American. And I didn't want to go back. And so I made the very painful decision to step down from that cockpit and say I was never going to fly fighter jets again. But I knew it was the right reason. I knew it was the right decision for me. I didn't know quite where it would take me, but I knew it was the right decision. And so I set about the next chapter of my life. I applied to graduate school, and I was lucky enough to go to Georgetown, which is where I meet this next gentleman in the room. And basically, if you haven't pieced this together, I'm collecting all my favorite people from each chapter of my life. But I met Meissan at business school, and Meissan was by far and away the smartest guy in class at business school, so I stored that one away. But we got to tour the world together, doing a great course at Georgetown, and at the end of Georgetown, I decided that I wanted to move to Manhattan and start a career in finance. And I didn't really want a career in finance, I just wanted to move to Manhattan and figure out a life in New York, because I thought New York would be fantastic. So I started a career in finance, and it absolutely sapped my soul. I found myself walking into work every day, sitting in a cubicle, not quite knowing what I was doing. I wasn't doing a whole lot of anything, and being utterly demoralized. And I knew, gosh, this is not for me. I've got to get out of here. And then one day, almost 10 years ago, I get a phone call that would change my life forever. So you'll recall I grew up in the northeast of England. And in the northeast of England, the town I'd recounted was, fairly socioeconomically deprived, written up in The Economist as the Detroit of the UK, and I promise it's not that good. But my dad had started a business in the UK in that little town, and that business had grown to be a fairly substantial employer. 200 people, it was in construction and development. And I got a phone call from my dad one night, and he said, "Son, the business is going bankrupt." He said, I'm lost. I need you to come back and help me. Now you can imagine, I've escaped this town, I've gone to the Air Force, I've flown with the United States Air Force, I've flown this thing, I've been to business school, I've done classes with Meissan, and now I'm living in New York City, and he's saying, "Hey, come back to this village in the northeast of England and help me fix this problem, because we're in trouble." And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll take the first flight back tomorrow." And I'd actually broken my shoulder, so I had to go to the hospital the next day to have some stitches removed before I could leave. But I said, "I'll be back with you the next day." And the last thing he said to me on the phone that night, or on Skype that night, was, "Son, I'm not sure that's going to be soon enough." And I thought he was referring to the business. And I woke up the next morning in New York City to news that would redefine who I was as a human being and would change my life forever. And, and that night my father committed suicide. And I woke up to that news, and I realized I'd hit a junction in my life where those dots connected. And I was in the right place at the right time, with the right education, with the right experience to go do what was going to be asked of me. The question was, could I look myself in the mirror and say, do I have the character to go do that? And of course, the answer was I had to go do that. So I jumped on a flight back to the UK, and I walked into my house, and I had my mom and 3 sisters, and I hold my mom in this arm and my 3 sisters in the other arm, and the police are there, and the bank are there, and the bank is saying, "Look, can we get a meeting with you really quickly?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you can get a meeting with me really quickly, but please let me just figure this out a little bit. So give me a day or so." So I dealt with my family. I went immediately to work, and I met the management team, and I said, "Guys and girls, I need you to get the whole company into the office tomorrow morning, because I need to speak to you. I need to speak to you all." And so they did. And I thought about it all night. How am I going to get these people to follow me on this journey? This company is about bankrupt. I've got 200 people looking at me saying, "What are we going to do?" And so I walked into to the office the next day, and I said, "Guys, girls, I'm going to give you access to my family that you haven't necessarily had. We're all obviously a family business, but yesterday morning my father committed suicide. and we're in trouble. We're in a tremendous amount of trouble. So I said, the next 6 months are going to be the biggest battle of our professional careers. And everything we do, everything we decide, all comes down to today, at this point in time. Can we look each other in the eye, as we did in the military, and say, I've got your back? Because we're about to embark on a journey that's going to involve a lot of sacrifice. But here's what we're going to do. Apprentices, I'm going to ask you to sacrifice, but your managers will sacrifice more than you. The directors, you guys will sacrifice more than the managers, and I will sacrifice as much as I can, more than you guys. And we got to work. And the challenge that life, God had given me at that point in time was so overwhelming to be sitting here in this town I'd run away from as a kid with a company that's bankrupt and 200 people and a family that's devastated. I'm dealing with my own grief, forcing myself to go to work every day and do what had to be done, was an education of a lifetime. And it was all preparation for what would ultimately come. I got the bank to back me. That's the good news. Over 6 years, we executed a turnaround of that business. We grew it, we sold it, we protected the pensions and livelihoods of a lot of people. In the process, I set up a foundation to support a community college. And Gary, we talked about this, to support a community college at a much lower level and a much lower scale than what you're doing here. But I see exactly the same things going on here. And I left that so my dad's name would continue. But I needed a new start because I was beat. So I said to my mom, who I'd made go on eHarmony and find a new husband, I said, Mom, you've got a new husband now. I need to go get on with my life, right? Because I need to get married, have kids, and do something that's going to make me happy. So she said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to go to California, and I'm going to follow a passion. And she said, okay. What are you going to do there? I said, I have no idea. So I picked up 2 bags, and I moved myself to California. I landed there. And I bought a surfboard. And I went out into the ocean. I sat on that surfboard every night, and I'd watch the sun go down in the ocean. And I'd cry, and I'd think, and I'd ask myself the difficult questions. And losing my dad in the way I did really crystallized what was important for me in life, right? So I think about time. All the money in the world with no time is literally worthless. All the time in the world with no money is pretty difficult. So where's the balance in there? How can I live as truthfully as I possibly can? What do I absolutely care about more than anything else? And I tried to answer those questions very honestly. And one of the things that occurred to me is that I've been flying airplanes since I was 15 years old. And I love flying. And I started thinking about this problem that bothered me. How do these guys, these patriots, these warfighters, my dear, dear friends that are incredible human beings, how do they train? What's going on with China right now? The situation is getting worse and worse and worse. I want to do something about this. Step 1, I need to go learn to fly because I haven't flown an airplane in a while. So I go to into a flight school at Santa Monica, and I see this kid. He's 21 years old, and I said, hey, I'd like to learn to fly. So he said, come with me. So I jumped in a little light sport airplane, and he took me flying, and he said, okay, this is straight and level. He said, okay, this is a turn. He said, oh, you're pretty good at this. And he said, this is a steeper turn. This is the first time I've ever heard that, by the way. And so he said, he goes, this is a steep turn. We land, and he's like looking at me, and we're walking, and he said, you know, I think you've got some potential. You should consider a career in aviation. And I said, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Again, the first time I'd ever heard that. So we sit down. He said, look, let me explain to you how a wing works. And I said, I'm probably good on that, so let me tell you my background and let me get my pilot's license back, basically. So I did that. And every day, and I'd walk through this hangar every day, and every day in the corner of this hangar, I'd see this beautiful experimental airplane, the one that you saw flying around on the video. And that experimental airplane is called a Berkut. It was built by a guy called Dave Ronenberg. Dave Ronenberg was one of the most prolific builders of the Long-Easies, the Burt Rutan design. And he'd evolved the Long-Easy into what we consider to be the pinnacle of canard aviation. And I struck up a friendship with Dave. And I went from being the CEO of this company in the UK to working as a mechanic fixing this guy's airplane. I'd pull apart the engine, I'd work on the brakes, and I really started to learn the airplane. And I fell in love with it. And I'd surf every night, and I'd sit on my surfboard, and I think, what do I want to do? What am I most passionate about? And I decided, I came up with the best idea. I said, I'm going to build an airplane. So I went in the next day full of excitement, and I said to Dave, Dave, I'd like to build an airplane. Great, he said. I said, yeah, I'd like to build a Berkut. Would you help me? He said, absolutely not. I said, huh. I wasn't expecting that. I said, Dave, okay, can you explain? He said, Dan, this airplane has cost me everything. Look, we only ever manufactured 70 kits. He said, there were a lot of accidents. He said, half the kits are missing. There are non-flying. I think there are only 12 airplanes in the world that are flying right now. And I've lost a lot of people because of this airplane, including my best friend, another F-18 guy, Navy, a guy called Rick Fessenden. I don't know if you ever came across Rick. But Rick Fessenden was the demo pilot for the Berkut, and had an accident in Santa Paula back in '96, I think it was, the year I joined the Air Force. Ironically, Rick was killed. And so I backed off, and I said, okay, fine, Dave, that's no problem, I understand. But I kept coming out, I kept showing up, and I kept working on his airplane and fixing brakes. And one day I walked into the hangar, and Dave said, hey, jump in the back of my airplane. I said, where are we going, Dave? He said, I'll show you. So we flew down to Temecula Desert, California, and we were met there by a gentleman called Samuel Puma. And Samuel Puma was a fighter pilot of a bygone era. Samuel was an F-4 pilot in Vietnam. And he had a great big cowboy hat and a cigar and a song for every occasion. And we sat there and we had a fantastic lunch with his family, but I didn't know why we were there. And after lunch, Sam and Dave said, should we show him? I said, show me what? He said, come with us, son. So we walked into the desert, and in a barn, under a tarpaulin cover, was this one remaining Berkut kit in pieces. And Dave looked at me and he said, Dan, this airplane was Rick Fessenden's airplane, the gentleman that was killed the year he joined the Air Force back in, I think it was '96, '95. He said, it's been sitting in the desert for 21 years waiting for you. He said, this is the last airplane I'm ever going to build. So it was a really spooky kind of, It felt right. It felt like life was telling me to go in this direction. Now, what I didn't tell you, back in 2005-06, when I came to the US Air Force, the US Air Force do call signs. Case in point, we have a TMAC and we have a monster in the audience right now. The UK, we don't do that. So when I came to the F-22, everyone was really experienced. So Monster very quickly figured out, hell, you don't have a call sign. You're going to be the first pilot on the F-22 that gets a call sign. And so for various reasons, some of which I can divulge right now, some of which we'll have to divulge over a beer later on, I got the call sign Bond. And it's not quite what you think. But I got the call sign Bond. Now, these guys didn't know any of this. So now we're like 12, 15 years later in the desert. And Sam called me up one day as I'm negotiating to buy the airplane. He said, Dan, I've dug out the paperwork on this airplane. I said, huh. Have you? He said, yeah, it was one of the very early pre-production versions of the airplane. He said, the serial number on this aircraft is 007. And I said, Sam, are you kidding me? He said, no. And I told him the story. He said, son, take the airplane. This is supposed to be. So I took the airplane and I committed to building the best version of this airplane that I could, the greatest Berkut the world has ever seen, which I think we've done. But you want to build an aerospace company? That's what it looks like. That's how you start, right? That is what you saw flying around in the video. That's how Red 6 started. And that was one of multiple 12-hour days in the back seat of that airplane standing. And they say if you want to build an airplane, it's going to cost you 2.25 wives or girlfriends or husbands per airplane that you build. And that was about right, because this thing was an all-consuming project. But life was telling me to build the airplane. I didn't understand why at the time. And then into my life walked two individuals, Nick Bichnich and Glenn Snyder, both with rich backgrounds in AR and VR. And here we are at the Red 6 story. At last, you say, we get to Red 6. And Glenn, back in 2015, in particular, had pulled off a world first in virtual reality. So for virtual, he created something called Virtual Drift. And Virtual Drift, he'd taken two race cars, put them on two separate racetracks at the same time in different locations, put two real race cars into the cars themselves, created a virtual reality system where both drivers put the headsets on. They looked left, they looked right, they met each other in this volcanic molten ash world, and they raced real race cars blind to the outside world against each other. And this is what it looked like.
Two racers, two separate tracks, but we're united on one virtual racetrack.
This is on another level. You've got the real physical forces combined with this mad world of the huge boulder flying through the sky, there's steam coming out of the ground. It's pretty amazing what the brain can cope with, and we're absolutely pushing that to the limit.
3, 2, 1, go!
This type of experience definitely opens up a ton of possibilities. I never even conceived that this was possible.
Does this advance or do I press it? I'm going to press it, see what happens. Yes. So when I saw that, I said two things. A, wow. B, have you done anything with this? I hadn't done anything with this. I'm like, okay, I have an idea. I'll come back to you in a couple of weeks. So I called the Air Force up and I said, hey, what are you guys doing about training right now? Has it gotten any better? And they said, well, you know, no, it's frankly terrible. And we think that synthetic training is the future. What do you mean by synthetic training? Well, we're working on something called live, virtual, and constructive. Tell me more about that. What is that? So live, we've got the problems I identified earlier on, right? So live, real pilots and real airplanes. Virtual, we're going to connect them into pilots and simulators on the ground, but we're going to beam them up into the air such that the aircraft systems think they're up there. That's cool. What about constructive? Constructive, it's great. AI generated. We're going to trick the aircraft systems into thinking that there are artificial intelligence-driven bandits up in the sky. I'm like, huh. I said, does that work within visual range? They said, oh, no, no. I said, well, that's a real problem then. And they said, yeah, it's a real problem. And let me explain why it's a real problem, because the role of the fighter pilot is twofold, right? These engagements, and we'll keep the ranges completely unclassified, so let's call it 100 mile for fighter pilot math. We're 100 miles away. We see something on our radar. We're looking down in a head-up display, and I see a threat coming towards me, or head-down display, sorry, and I see a threat coming towards me. And I start firing missiles. And they start firing missiles back at me. And we're trading missile shots. And those ranges start collapsing. And that's called a beyond visual range environment. So the role of the fighter pilot is, think of it as a tactician, a chess player. We're moving our forces around a piece of sky. But as those ranges start to collapse and we get to within 10 nautical miles, we start to transition into a different role. And that different role is really violent. It's you're putting a gum shield in and you're going for the proverbial fist fight. We're going to go to the merge, we're going to visually engage, and we're going to dogfight, the kind of stuff you're used to seeing in Top Gun. And the problem with the live, virtual, constructive, or synthetic training environment is at that point, as you skip through this line and you start to look out, the whole training system collapses. Why is that? Because there's no physical way of putting the synthetic assets into the field of view of the pilots. Why is that? Well, I was about to find out. So I said, Air Force, I'll get back to you, stand by. So I called Nick and Glenn up. I said, can we have a meeting at Santa Monica? He said, yeah. So they came in. I said, look, virtual drift that you've just shown me, I've got two questions. Is that possible in airplanes? So they scratched their heads for a couple of weeks and came back with, yeah, we think this may be possible, although technically challenging. Okay, great. No one is going to allow fighter pilots to fly around like those car drivers in virtual reality. Can we do that in augmented reality? And they looked at me like I was an idiot. And they were right. And they said, no. I said, why? They said, because augmented reality doesn't work outdoors or in dynamic environments. And I said, huh, why? And so began my education into true AR working outdoors in augmented reality. So I challenged the guys, and basically, and the cliff notes are, I kept asking why until they got sick of me, and we figured collectively, we came up with a thesis as to how we felt that might work. Because if I could put an augmented reality SU-37, I'll ask Monster later, I think it's an SU-37. If I could put an augmented reality bad guy up in the sky, and I could connect that into the broader live virtual constructive ecosystem, well, I've ushered in something pretty special, a new paradigm in training. And my vision was, what if we could create Ender's Game? What if I could create this entirely synthetic battle space in which real pilots and real airplanes can connect, and they can fly against whoever they want, whenever they want, and as many numbers as they want. And the threats are representative of the kind of threats that we may be called, God forbid, to go against in real life. That is something really special. So I'm like, okay, Glenn, Nick, we think we can do this? They said, well, kind of. I'm like, all right, that's good enough for me. I'll go back to the Air Force. So I called the Air Force up again. Hey, do you remember me? Okay, I think I can save you billions of dollars. I think I can solve your training crisis, and I think I can allow you to train against any near-peer threat. And so they said, okay, call the Air Force Research Laboratory to speak to those guys. So we did. And I spoke to a guy called Dr. Wink Bennett, fabulous American. Some of you will know him. Wink's fantastic. He's been with us right from the beginning. And I said, hey, Wink, this is what we're working on. And he said, are you kidding? I said, no. He said, we've been looking for this for the last 5 years. No one's doing it. Is it possible? So I said, absolutely. In PowerPoint. So he said, okay, come out to Vegas and see it. So we went out to sit with Wink, and they briefed us around the SLATE program that the Air Force Research Laboratory are doing, live virtual constructive. And we got to sit down, and I looked at what they were doing, and I thought, my goodness, this is incredible. If we can pull this off, then we've got something really special. So we need to get to work. So we got to work. So the airplane cockpit you saw me sitting in backwards standing became this over a period of about 18 months of really hard work. And as we were starting to build out the aircraft, I'm like, life told me to build an airplane. Wouldn't it be great if this airplane became the test platform for the technology that we are about to prove? So that was the genesis of Red 6. And I looked to God, and I look at the world, and I go, interesting. I'm building an airplane. These guys have got an idea around tech. How about we build the airplane around the technology? So the airplane you see there is not just a Bocuse experimental, which is super fun, I'm deeply passionate about, and it's great to fly, and it's great to let my friends fly, and everything. It's actually a living, flying AR research laboratory as well. And the coders, Glenn Snyder in particular, has spent hundreds of hours throwing up in the backseat of that airplane, coding real time. And the Air Force said, guys, these are some big claims you're making. So we're going to give you a series of milestones to jump through, and we embarked upon the SBIR program. And the first milestone was prove that your approach to augmented reality would work in a static environment on the ground. So I think this was November of, I can't remember, it was a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, maybe February of 2019. That was it, February of 2019. So we had a who's who of the Air Force come see us, weapons school, test pilot school, research laboratory, Air Combat Command, Air Education Command. We said, come out to Santa Monica and sit in our amazing flight simulator demo, which was this airplane with a pretend engine on at the back and a propeller I had to borrow from a friend because we didn't have one. And we rolled it into a hangar at Santa Monica, and we had this really clunky demo of a headset. But it was an approach and a thesis that's different. This is how we're going to solve augmented reality outdoors. And this is a true story. The Air Force were arriving at 9 o'clock on the Friday morning. In the previous week, I had had around 6 hours of sleep in the previous 5 days because the tech wasn't working. And we'd gone through 2 back-to-back 24-hour shifts. And at 8 o'clock on the morning of 8 o'clock on Friday morning, 1 hour before the Air Force were due to arrive, the keyboard from the back seat of the cockpit with Glenn in it went flying across the room and smashed against the wall because the tech still wasn't working. And that represents something of a crisis. So we calmed ourselves down, and about 30 minutes before the Air Force arrived, the tech sprang into life. And I'm not exaggerating. About 8:30 in the morning, the tech started working. And the Air Force arrived, and we run through 12 demos seamlessly, back to back to back to back to back. You couldn't write this stuff. And it was a clunky, prototypical demo that kind of sort of worked, but it was sufficient to paint a picture of what I thought the future was. And it was enough to get the Air Force to back us in the SBIR program. So off the back of that, we raised our first round of institutional venture capital, and we had a runway now to go attack this problem. And we went through a series of milestones. And the series of milestones were, okay, obviously, guys, go prove that this works up in the air. And what we'd like you to do initially is, rather than claim you can have airplanes flying around the sky and dogfights and all that kind of stuff, just fix one object in space for us. Put a cube up in space and demonstrate to us that you can take off in your airplane, fly up to that cube, observe a cube in the distance, and as you get closer to it, it gets bigger, and it looks and feels and acts like a three-dimensional object in space. And so you probably saw in the video at the beginning that the framed cube that we built, and we made it deliberately a framed cube because I wanted to demonstrate the immersive aspects and the immersive value of augmented reality. And what I'm talking about is it's a framed cube. So as I get close to this cube and I'm flying up there and I'm lifting my visor up and there's nothing there, and I put it down, there's a cube there. As I'm flying, getting closer and closer to it, I can start to fly through the cube because it appears that there's no sides. And as I go through the cube, it is so immersive and so compelling that I try not to hit the wings of the airplane on the framed sides of the cube. And it sounds crazy, but it serves to illustrate the point. Augmented reality is something very, very special if we can get it right. So when the Air Force came to see us, we liked to underpromise and overdeliver. We took them to the cube. They were blown away. It was fantastic. And once we'd done the cube demonstration, we said, okay, check this out. So we went to the next scenario. In that next scenario, we had an airplane flying around the skies of Southern California. And we had a KC-46 tanking aircraft literally flying a tanking orbit around the skies of Southern California. And I could fly an intercept on that airplane, see it in the distance. I could pull up alongside it as we would for real. I can fly formation. I can drop in behind. I can see the air-to-air refueling boom sticking down. And the tracking solution we've created is so accurate that I can drive the boom of that tanker into my head. I can observe all of the colors on the stick as I would for real. They were blown away. We take them off the tanker, and now we go do an engagement against a Russian Su-57. And we do the genesis of a dogfight. We see very basic maneuvering from this thing. So the Air Force were believers, and they transitioned us to a SBIR phase 2 from that. We kept raising money in the venture capital world. We kept telling the story. Christina Babbitt at the back, I have to say you're astonishing because you helped me tell this story, but Christina's done incredible work in terms of helping me to articulate the story and get it out there. But we kept telling the story because I'm trying to inspire people to buy into this vision that we've got, because this future of synthetic augmented reality training is not a dream anymore. This is there. The tech is working. And we kept evolving the technology with the Air Force. We started transitioning to our first real contract, which is a SBIR phase 3. It's a $70 million contract with the Air Force. And we're about to do our integration into the first Air Force platform, a T-38. And at this point, the technology has matured to a state where not only can I take off in this beloved little airplane and we can go up into the sky and we can go to the cube and we can go fly an air-to-air refueling sortie, but I can bring up a Chinese J-20 that looks and feels and acts like a Chinese J-20. And that J-20 now is driven by artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence is thinking and flying and fighting for itself. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about me being in a real airplane with a headset on. I'm looking out of the window, and I see a Chinese J-20. And this Chinese J-20 is flying basic fighter maneuvers. It is dogfighting in relation to me correctly, which is absolutely incredible to see on the one hand, absolutely terrifying on the other in terms of what this means. But I'm here to tell you that this is not a dream. It's not a vision anymore. It is here.